Genealogy. I am AD, and I am here to. We are at part three of exploring the Slave Voyages website. And if you are new here, welcome. Thank you for joining me. Again, I am on part three, and let's keep going, y'all. Like the first episode, we just sort of went through the different tabs and just learned more about the purpose of this website and how the research was done. The second page focus, or the second video, excuse me, part two, focus on the transatlantic slave trade specifically. And we're going to continue that going through all of the tabs. All right, let's get to it. So we ended here on the classifications as a transatlantic slaving voyage, and let's keep going. So one of the important problems slave trade researchers need to address is whether the vessels bound for Africa and the sources are slaving vessels. This is important. And see how they put, is it actually coming from Africa, right? As late as the end of the 17th century, slaves formed less than half of the trade by value between the Atlantic world and Africa. Many captains sailed to Africa to purchase gold, ivory, dyewoods, and spices. Numerous naval vessels, troop transports, or store ships sailed from Lisbon to the Portuguese forts in all these, these different places. And other European powers needed to supply their trading forts as well. For most of the French, Portuguese, and Dutch voyages to Africa, researchers other than ourselves have made the decision on whether or not a ship was a slaver, though we have uncovered a few additional voyages from these nations where the object of the voyage remains unclear. It might be noted that records of ship departures have typically survived better in the historical records than records of ship arrivals. Okay, so let's unpack that, right? First, um, they can't always identify where the ship came from or is going. Okay, and what's on the ship. So sometimes it could be enslaved people, other times it can be goods, right? Let's keep going. For many British and Portuguese voyages, however, we had to make some hard decisions in determining whether vessels were slavers or non-slavers, enslavers. Um, Many British and North American voyages returned to the port of origin after a an interval of time during which a slave voyage could have taken place, but no information survives of the places of the trade in Africa or the Americas. For most of these ships, clearance for was for Africa and the Americas, and many of the remainder in this group are ships leaving British American ports for Africa. So they're leaving British American ports for Africa. Before the 19th century, ships rarely went to the Americas to Africa for anything but slaves. In all in all these cases, the ship is assumed to have been a slaver. Slaver is such a weird word. I know it's just direct, but slaver, let's use colonizer, captive, capturer, something else. Um, for several hundred more voyages from Brazil, even less is known. In Bahia, the main source of information on these is licenses of ship departures which specify Elmina in West Africa. I actually went to that slave dungeon before as the permitted destination. Large rolls of local tobacco were the trade good for African bound Bahia ships, and in the 18th century, slaves, traders of all nations depended on this tobacco. As with North American African bound ships, there is no evidence of a significant produce trade between Brazil and Africa. Gold was important in the first half of the 18th century, and alcohol became more important later in the century. But return cargoes were always human. After 1680, many Portuguese voyages from Brazil show up in British records from Cape Coast castles, slave dungeons. They're not castles. Cape Coast dungeons, as well as the Dutch records for Elmina. And in the 19th century, there is there is very good overlap between these licenses and the observations of British observers on the movement of slave ships. We have made the decision to include these Bahia African voyages in the dataset. Nevertheless, we do have a file of 1,400 Atlantic voyages that might have carried slaves, but for which we are awaiting additional evidence. The majority of these certainly sailed from Europe to the Caribbean and then back again without sailing anywhere near Africa, but we cannot be absolutely certain and can retain information on them for future use as necessary. These doubtfuls are troublesome, but their numbers compared to the voyages about which we are quite certain, are not great. All right, hold on. There's something I wanted to point out really quick. So when we talk about tobacco, tobacco is a plant and a crop that is born in the Americas, or that are native to the Americas, and I know specifically in North America. So keep that in mind. Another important part about this is knowing what what props and crops are native to what land. So I know they talked about, Bahia and in Brazil, right? But also know that tobacco is also a United States, North American crop as well. So keep that in mind. All right. There remains the question of produce ships, defined as ships that sail to Africa to trade for animal products, agricultural commodities, or materials. We have identified 1,450 voyages that departed Africa without obtaining slaves. In some cases, they carried supplies for the European castles on the coast, but in the majority of instances, they traded for African produce before returning directly to Europe. In addition, there were always a few tenders each year that went to the coast to supply slaves for a new ship, for a larger ship, but did not themselves carry slaves across the Atlantic. The great majority of these non slaving ships were Dutch and British, and the two nations that carried on the largest trades in African produce. We have identified produce as opposed to slave vessels, sometimes on the basis of their voyage histories, sometimes on the known activities of their captains, and sometimes on the basis of small crew to tonnage ratios, suggesting they were not vessels that required additional crew to control slaves. Okay, that's important to understand and to distinguish between. That's why it's like sometimes this, sometimes that. It's important. Both the produce traders and the doubtful traders had, are held in a separate file, and in the former case will be used as the base for separate work on the African produce traffic. Finally, not all voyages that crossed the Atlantic from Africa carried slaves. Of course, generally we have assumed that all such voyages were slaving voyages, and have included them in the dataset, though there is a slight possibility that a few of these vessels traded at produce markets on the coast. In summary, about 5% of the voyages included in the data set lack information about their activities around the voyages began. We nevertheless feel fairly confident that these were slaving voyages, and as noted, those about which we feel less confident we retain in a separate file. Okay. All right. Slave outcomes. Obviously, not all slave ships made it to the Americas or even to Africa. Okay. Fortunately, the data set is quite rich in information on the outcome of voyages. The data set allows for 184 different voyages outcomes. As with the geographical variables, some regrouping is required to make these more manageable. The first regrouping, outcomes of voyages for slaves, Fate 2, takes the standpoint of the Africans on board and as where the ship debarked its slaves. The majority of these disembarked in the Americas, but about 12% in the present sample died during the voyage. In addition, some who left African ports actually disembarked in another part of Africa or on the island of St. Helena. About 2% of all slaves recorded. Most of this latter group were captured by British naval cruisers in the 19th century, though a very few in the previous century ended up in Europe. A second regrouping, outcome of voyage if ship captured, Fate 3, is concerned with the fate of the ship and who might have interfered with its voyage. Slaves rebelled, shore based Africans or pirates attacked ships, and one European power could have tried to seize ships flying the flag of other powers, especially in wartime. Finally, the third regrouping, outcome of voyage for owner, Fate 4, takes the standpoint of the owners. The group's voyages on the basis of whether the ships reached the Americas, and if not, rather it was human agency or natural hazard that was responsible. As indicated, each of these three regroupings is represented by a different variable. Something on here that I wanted to highlight. I am so happy that we're reading through this because I am learning so much about how they. Okay, where's St. Helena? Why have I never heard of this territory before? I need to see it in the map. Okay. Again, I have to make sense. Okay. A small island. Okay. But it's like it's going toward Brazil will make the most sense. Right? Instead of. Okay, let's look at the. To be honest, wouldn't it have been easier to take folks from like Morocco and just go straight across? But so you have to go, say we're going from Nigeria, you have to kind of go down and around to get. So that's a long, what's the word I'm looking for? Commute. And so going from, okay, Ghana straight to St. Helena makes sense, right? Or even if you're coming from like Angola, that's perfect. But when we start getting to Angola, is that considered southern Africa or is that still considered central? I guess it's still considered central. I guess Namibia and Zimbabwe are more considered southern Africa. But yeah, okay. So again, I have to understand, have to put things in context because we just seeing names, reading places, seeing new words. You have to understand what you're reading. All right, and then the last part of okay, whether it was a human agency or a natural disaster was responsible. So you know, then there could have been slaves that rebelled. There were, say, the Africans that were on shore tried to help, pirates, another European. So it's a lot of like I like the word that they're using variables because there are a lot of factors to consider. It's not a one size fits all. Although they try to portray it like that to us, it's not. And when I say they, I'm meaning the narrative, the traditional narrative that okay, yeah, we all came from Africa. The slave trade happened, but it didn't just happen as quick or as flawless as it seemed, right? Okay, inferring places of trade. So, again, it's a lot of information. And so, again, when I see numbers, I want to stop. Of the 36,000 voyages in the data set, at least 1,580 did not embark slaves. We know that. Um, Usually on account of the capture or um, natural hazard of these of those that did obtain slaves, several hundreds failed to complete the middle passage, which we read in the previous one. I see more numbers. The data set provides some information on African place of trade for 21,700 voyages, and about half of those were likely to have obtained slaves. But that likely, it's the uncertainty in language that I'm paying attention to. While this information surpasses current knowledge of the geography of the slave trade, it is possible to glean yet more of 4,142 voyages that left Africa with slaves, or it could have done so in the sense that the ship was not wrecked or captured prior to trade beginning. We may not know the African place of embarkation, but we do know where the captain intended to buy slaves. If we assume that he did in fact do what was intended, that after eliminating those locations that are not easy to group into regions, for example, the French designation of the Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, we left with 20 we are left with 25,842 voyages that contain several information on place of Africa trade, or about 60% of those vessels in our samples that actually did and could have left Africa with slaves. The imputed variable combines actual with intended places of embarkation, and those other groups these values into specific regions and broad regions of embarkation respectively. I said respectfully. All right, so switching to the other side of the Atlantic. Okay, what's the other side? Okay. How valid are the assumptions imputed? So, how valid are the assumptions? Most slave ships traded in regions where owners declared they would trade, while, after eliminating captured ships that rarely completed their voyages as intended, as well as those ships with a very broad um, defined destination, such as Americas, British North America, a Pearson product moment correlation run on ports of arrival in the Americas generate a coefficient of 0.83, or number 9,541. A similar procedure for a region of trade in Africa and attended region of trade produced a Pearson product moment correlation of 0.714. Numbering, or in the number form, is 13,951. If should also or it should also be kept in mind that merchandise always had to be loaded in Europe and the Americas for a specific African region, and was also often impossible to sell in another region. That's it. Yes, that's important to highlight. It was unusual to find a specific manufactured good selling in more than one region. Taking together this evidence appears sufficiently strong to allow some modest inferences for those voyages that we know purchased slaves in Africa or subsequently disembarked slaves in other parts of the Atlantic world, and for which the intended but not the actual region of trade is known. All right, last paragraph. In addition to these um, inferential issues, inferential issues, there are also known biases in the geographic data. The British signed three treaties with the Portuguese between 1810 and 1817. So 7 years, three treaties that contain clauses limiting Portuguese slave traders to regions of Africa south of the equator, and the last two of the treaty allowed British cruisers to capture Portuguese ships that did not adhere to the provisions. Brazil assumed these treaties when that country became independent in 1822. From 1815, slave ships arriving in Bahia, which had strong trading relations with the Bight of Benin or slave coast north of the equator, usually reported their African ports of departure as Cambinda, Banambo ports just north of the Congo. British officials in Bahia, as well as the naval officers patrolling the African coast, were convinced that all Bahian ships nonetheless continued to trade on the slave coast. All right, so you got more numbers here from the coast of Africa. So the deaths, number of voyages. So all of Africa, the number of voyages. All right, let's keep going. Regions of embarkation and disembarkation. Okay. Slave. Oh, excuse me. Gender and age. Oh, I got hiccups. Excuse me. Got child or infants. Adults, children distinguished. Several age and genders variables were derived from the data points. Female, male. National carriers. Flag. Some ships, no methods. Enable one to impute national registration. Because of the trade in North American mainland displayed characteristics quite different from its British counterpart, we made the decision to label all such voyages as U.S., even though the U.S. did not exist before 1776. This decision made it easier for users from the modern U.S., the location of the great majority of our audience, to engage with their country's long involvement in the slave trade users who download the database, of course. Okay. Tonnage. Perhaps the most difficult to compute variables. Of course. Okay. So again, in the previous video, we looked up the word tonnage, tonnage, and it pretty much is the ship, is the boat. And so for the first line to say perhaps the most difficult of the imputed variables developed for the database is the standard tonnage, because again we don't know what type of ships that were used, the size, how many people, how many crew members, as they stated in previous pages or previous information. Sometimes they also had additional things on the ship, whether it was other goods, and although they couldn't sell it from region to region, they still may have had it on the plane. So, excuse me, on the boat. All right, we're gonna keep going. Resistance and price of slaves. So the last variable is resistance, of course. Um, fighting back. Let's see. And then the prices of the human beings in the Americas were subject to change and influenced the prices in other markets. Key factors included characteristics of a person being sold, the distance between slave markets in the Americas and Africa, and the price of the captive in Africa. This variable attempted to adjust for several of these factors, so the underlying price trends becomes apparent to the user of Voyages. In most cases, the data are taken from the slave trades, the traders' accounts, and correspondence. Our first goal was to ensure that we recorded a single category of captive, what was frequently referred to at the time as a prime male. Okay, gotcha. Um, Second, we adjusted the price for the price differential between the market in which the slave was actually sold and the price in Jamaica. Thus, if the captive was sold in one of the eastern Caribbean islands, we will make a small adjustment upward to reflect the 10 extra days selling time it would take to reach Jamaica. Third, we converted all prices into pounds sterling. We did what we did not do was to express the price in constant pounds adjusted for inflation. In other words, in real terms, this variable is thus based on archival data. The above discussion is not exhaustive in the sense that we have not that we have not touched on or explained every single variable in either the Voyages interface or the two database offered for downloading. Many of the variables need no more explanation than available on the variables list. All right, we have our appendix. What are some notes? Okay, so the bibliography. Let's look at the variables list. So we know they use SPSS. Remember we talked about fate 1, 2, and 3, and 4. Okay. And then let's go to sources. Okay, so again, as a researcher, as an educator, as a student, I love looking at resources because, again, this is how I continue to build my Google Doc of important information. So when I want to go to the primary source, just scroll all the way down, look at what was used to, create whatever document we're looking at. It's good information for you to read for yourself. And again, my whole purpose for going through all of this is that, I want us to make meaning for ourselves. I want us to understand what we are looking at because, again, this is so much information. And I'm sure that all of the researchers worked really hard. I know how difficult it is to not only collect data but to analyze it. That is the hardest part, is analyzing it, and then sharing that data in a way that the reader can or the reader can understand, the user can understand, right? Because sometimes when you're in the data, you know what it says, you know what it means, but what about the audience that was not a part of that process? They need to understand what is going on too. And so again, I know this process isn't easy, and so providing places where I can go look for myself, I'm definitely going to go look for myself. All right, so we went through pretty much everything here when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade. Um, I want to get into the database. Let's get in, actually, I want to go into essays first. Okay, let's just kind of see. I'm just going to skim through really quick. I'm not going to read the paragraphs. I'm tired of reading right now. But I just like seeing what is all offered here. So it talked about the Middle Passage, the ending of slavery, the trade's influence on ethnic and racial identity. I think this is important. And I do want to read this really quickly, especially as we are looking at our genealogy. And some folks, depending on where your family is from, they have changed their race from Negro, Black, Mulatto to, Black American, whatever. Actually, okay, let's read it. In the Atlantic around or after 1492, oceans that had hermetically sealed peoples and cultures from other sprouted sea lanes almost overnight. Cultural accommodations between peoples, in this case between Europeans and non-Europeans, always took time. The big difference was that before Columbus, migrations had been gradual and tended to move outward from the more to less densely populated parts of the globe. But Columbian contact was sudden, and the inhabited was, excuse me, and inhabited any gradual adjustment, cultural as well as epidemiological. A merging of perceptions of right and wrong, group identity, and relations between sexes to look only at the top of the very long list of social values cannot be expected to occur quickly in a post Columbian world. In short, cultural adjustment could not keep pace with transportation technology. The result was first the rise, and then as perceptions of the insider outsider divide slowly changed, the fall of the transatlantic slave trade in enslaved Africans. During the long coercive interlude of forced transatlantic migration, European and African conceptions of self and community and eligibility for enslavement did not remain static. On the African side, the majority of the major effect of the African European exchange was to encourage an elementary Pan Africanism along, at least among victims. Interesting. Among victims. The initial and unintentional impact of European seaborne contact was to force non elite Africans to think of themselves as a part of a wider African group. Initially, this group might be Igbo or Yoruba, or soon, in addition, black as opposed to white. At the most elemental level, by the late 18th century, the slaves at James Island vowed to drink the blood of the white man. And a little later, one third of the slaves in a carefully planned conspiracy will go in the village and be disparaged, disparaged, dispersed. Y'all, I can't read right now. To massacre the whites, and when asked whether it were true that they had planned to massacre all of the whites in the island, the two leaders, far from denying the fact or looking for prevarication, provocation. Y'all, I'm learning new words. Answered with boldness and courage that nothing was truer. Many similar incidents could be cited from the American side of the Atlantic, and on board a slave ship with slaves always and on board with the on a slave ship with the slaves always black and a crew largely white, skin color defined ethnicity. Oh, why was I struggling with that? Okay, hold on. Paul, before I move on, I gotta know what these words means. So pre means before. We always looking at the prefixes, suffixes, so us to know what's going on. Avoiding telling the truth. Okay.
Prevarication.
Prevarication. Okay. Perfect. And then what was the other part? It was another word here that I kind of dispersed. Dispersed. I'm saying sparsed. Dispersed.
Dispersed.
I know that. Okay, moving on. Yeah, we students, baby. Ain't no shame in my game with this one. We gotta move forward. Eventual abolition, and there was notes here. The seasonality of the transatlantic slave trade. I think that is interesting title, and this was written in 2008. Let's go back. Is everything here written 2008, 2007, 7, 7? Okay. So agriculture. We talked about agriculture and how you have the mullet. Okay, what is it here? During the era of the slave trade, 1514 through 1866, most sub-Saharan Africans from rural communities forced across the land continued their farming. In the New World, they grew familiar provisions, including crops imported from Africa. Yep, and here we go. Remember, I told you that tobacco is an American or, yeah, indigenous to the Americas. However, many saw crops like sugar, tobacco, coffee, indigo, cocoa, cacao, and cotton for the first time. So now I have a question. Who taught them how to toil this land? Was it, again, the white Europeans may not have known either. So who taught them how to grow these new crops that they'd never seen before? There was not a training session. Again, the language, they don't speak the same language. So how did this happen? I just have a question about that, you know? Or again, are the indigenous people in the Americas still, are they also enslaved and teaching? But again, now you have three different languages going. I got questions. I don't know. Though historians lack data on pre-colonial African demography, it is reasonable to suggest that most Africans forced overseas were farmers and pastors. The men and women and adults and children helped to produce yearly supplies of millet, rice, maize, yams, cassava, plantains, and other crops. Or plantains, I know.
Pastoralists.
Pastoralists. Pastoralists. Men and women, adults, and children help to produce. Okay, we talked about that. The ratio of men, women, and children working on farms vary by crops and regions, but all villages work together, clearing land, planting, weeding, storing crops to produce sufficient amounts of food to enable communities to survive through the out of crop hungry seasons. Smaller numbers of enslaved Africans transported across the Atlantic were craftsmen or professionals. As African towns grew in size in the late 18th and 19th centuries, so did the number of urban residents who were enslaved. For more than 11 million African people who survived the Middle Passage, the majority would labor on plantation lands producing provisions and cash crops. As in Africa, ratios of men, women, and children working in the fields varied in crops and region, and the hungry months occurred before the year's harvest. About 5.25 million African migrants worked in sugar canes, and perhaps 1.5 million um, toil on tobacco, coffee, rice, indigo, cotton, and um, the cacao estates. Another 1.5 million people worked in livestock pens or on plantations producing millet, maize, wheat, cassava, and or forestry products. An estimate 1 million enslaved Africans worked in silver and gold mining, but mostly before 1750. Brazilian gold, um, important particularly in 1690 through 1750, grew in perhaps 500,000 African workers. Household work or ranching occupied the lives of 750,000 to 1 million African men, women, and children. Y'all, we just gonna keep going. We talked about the rainfall, seasonal rainfall. This is important. I want to come back later and talk about shifting masses, the rain equator, raindrops, calendars, agriculture calendars, and labor requirements, provisioning slaving seasons. So, y'all, it's so much stuff on here. You have a case study, harvest, transatlantic pathways and harvest cycles, and a conclusion. And then it keeps going here to more of the talking about the other Americas. Is a new writer. This also includes David. I noticed the dates stop appearing. And then this is so this was a slave in Maryland. So again, I have to come back and look at that. 1873. My great grandparents were born by then. So yeah, Voyages in Applied History. So yeah, that is the transatlantic slave trade and its data. Um, all right. So I'm gonna pause this and we'll wait for part 4 to start going into learning, just getting the numbers together. Alrighty, see y'all later. Peace.